Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Finding Money for Sustainable Renovations, brought to you by Open Architecture Collaborative, AIA, Housing Knowledge Communities, and EDI International. I'm the facilitator for today, Tommy Burns. I am a graduate of Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. I became interested in housing and community development in school. I did some traveling to Haiti and some more studying in community development after graduating from my architecture program. I did a little work in Haiti with Mass Design Group, and I'm currently a job captain at Davis Square Architects in Somerville, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston, with a primary focus of affordable housing. Our first presenter today is Nikita Reed. She co-founded Encore Sustainable Design to focus on good design, preservation, and making buildings more sustainable. She is a licensed architect skilled in the design of restoration and adaptation reuse projects. Mrs. Reed has been the lead accredited professional on many new and historic buildings and is well versed in ways to incorporate sustainable features into new and existing buildings. She has experience working with various governmental agencies, from counties to GSA, the Navy and Veteran Affairs Administration. She is trained in multiple sustainability platforms, including LEED and Green Globes, and she serves as chair of the Maryland Green Building Council. Our second presenter today is Mark James. He's the founder and president of Urban Green and has over 18 years of experience in affordable housing and sustainable development. Mr. James has managed the development of over 1.5 million square feet of housing and commercial buildings valued at more than $200 million. His professional background includes specializations in multi-layered housing finance, including tax credit and tax-exempt bond financing, affordable housing preservation, for sale housing, and sustainable energy solutions, including solar, geothermal, and fuel cell applications. The learning objectives for today: number one, how funding affects a project schedule, i.e. how much design work is needed to apply for different types of funding. Number two, how much of a project can be funded with historic tax credits. Number three, where to find rebates for sustainable improvement. And number four, resources to help clients find additional project funding. In the course description, architecture projects can be put on hold and stall out due to funding issues, something I have definitely seen in my career. Although funding is often outside of the architect's scope, knowing about the various funding options that exist can add value to the project and keep the project on schedule. Join this discussion as an architect and developer talk through ways to creatively fund single and multifamily housing renovations. And if you have any questions today, technical or content related, you can submit them in the question and answer chat box you should see on your screen. Any technical issues should be answered right away, and we're going to try to keep most of the content related questions or comments for the end of the broadcast. Today's materials are copyright. Please take a moment to look over this slide. And please take a moment to look over the compliance statement. And following today's presentation, you'll receive a survey where, through email, we ask for you to fill that out. This way you will get your credits, your continuing education credits, as well as any feedback you have for us. And we'll also have an opportunity for you to submit any questions if they aren't answered at the end of the broadcast. All right, and with that, I'd like to welcome Nikita Reed to kick off the presentation. Thank you for doing this with us today. I'm very excited.
Of course. Well, thank you for having us. And can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. All right. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So as Tommy mentioned, I am an architect, and my firm specializes in existing and historic buildings, multifamily renovations, and making existing buildings greener. One of the things that we often find when we're getting involved in these projects is that we get involved and we're thinking we're going to go straight from schematic design through the entire design process, as you can see on the screen. So it'd be going SD, giving client approvals, and working our way through to permit submission, bidding, construction, doing the whole thing. What we found, unfortunately, is that most of the time our projects only have funding to get really through the end of CDs if we're lucky. And one of the questions that we often get is, well, what other funding sources are there that we could go after for some of these existing buildings? And we want to make them greener, but where's the funding to do that? And so in most cases, we have clients who have funding through CDs. In some cases, we have funding only through design development, and sometimes it's only 50% design development. So knowing from the beginning and having that conversation with our client about how much funding they have helps us inform how much design we do to prevent us from doing more design than the project can actually allow. Because a lot of times there will be a hurry up and wait situation, which I'm sure many designers are familiar with, where we need to get quickly through CD and SD to go in for the funding round applications, but then we have to wait until we find out if the project's actually going to get funded. And so being mindful of how much design actually needs to happen for those applications can be very helpful, and also protect us from doing more work that we may or may not be able to get paid for. So from our viewpoint, we're going to walk through these funding options with the following criteria. One, we know it's an existing building that's going to be renovated. The developer has some of the funds to do the work, but there is a gap. And the developer is considering using private resources and funds, and is asked for what additional funding sources should they consider. And so we're really going to be looking at 4 different types of funding over the next couple minutes. So historic tax credits, as well as grants, rebates, and CPACE. And CPACE is Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. And all of these funding sources that we're about to go through, I want to mention that this is an ad service that we will offer if requested. And so I just want to make it clear that we're not taking on helping find all of these funding sources under the architectural contract. We do go into a separate consulting contract for that. So just something for designers to keep in mind as they're structuring contracts and how they're trying to help the developer and project move forward. So we're going to start with the historic tax credits. This is a program that is not available in every state in the country, but it is widespread, as you can see. The states in brown are the ones that already have historic tax credits in place, and the ones in yellow are where they're proposed. It varies per state, but various things can be included in historic tax credit applications. And we found that a lot of our clients aren't aware of this. As many of you know, historic preservation in this country exists on a sliding scale. So for all intents and purposes, anything that is 50 years old from the current date could be eligible for listing on the National Register and may already be in a National Register historic district. Those are the 2 main criteria that you would want to pay attention to see if historic tax credits are a viable option to pursue. So if the building is located in a National Register historic district, just a contributing resource to it, that's enough for it to be eligible to be considered for historic tax credits. Some of the items that are typically included and eligible within the historic tax credit are soft costs, so your design fees, as well as hard costs. So some of the walls, partitions, flooring, new elevators, anything that is permanently attached to a building and is not an addition or change in volume to that building is typically eligible for a historic tax credit. Items that typically aren't eligible include acquisition costs, additions, appliances, things like that. But one of the nice things is that some of the states have tax credits both at the state level and at the local level. A lot of times the local historic tax credit is in the form of a property assessment or a relief on the property tax. So knowing that you could go after local historic tax credits, state historic tax credits, as well as federal historic tax credits is often a program that we find helpful for existing buildings that are a bit older. And a lot of times our clients aren't thinking about those. One of the other things I should mention is that the federal historic tax credit, this was initially eliminated during the 2017 tax reform, but it has been brought back. So the 20% federal historic tax credit is still in existence. Of the federal level, you're able to get up to 20% of the project's qualified rehabilitation expenditures covered. And then you're also able to match the tax credits together at the different levels. So for instance, in Maryland, there are county level tax credits as well as state level tax credits and federal tax credits. And we've done projects where we've been able to help clients get up to 60% funded because they're doing the 20% county, 20% state, 20% federal. So that's one of the options. The way the process works is that you typically identify the building, you go through the application process, and the agencies that are involved in the process, depending upon which level you're going for, are typically the National Park Service, the state's SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, and then if you're doing any sort of sustainability certification, then Enterprise Green Communities and also different HERS ratings could come in as well. You go through the typical design process, you renovate it, and then when the project is complete, the tax credit is claimed. And so a lot of times people get confused and think that the historic tax credit is just a suitcase of money at the beginning of the project, and that's not the case. A lot of times the way that the tax credits are used in the project is that they're syndicated through other investors. So for instance, if you find an investor who needs the tax credits and they say, okay, go through the application process. If it finds out that you'll be able to get awarded the tax credits, we'll pay you 85 or 90 cents on the dollar of the tax credits that you would get as equity into your project so you can do the work and then claim the tax credits on the back end. So it's a little bit of a complicated process, but it is still a very viable funding source that we've used successfully with nonprofits and for-profits, and it's a program that's healthy across the states. And the tax credit decision, you typically find out and you decide if you're going to do the tax credit before you get to design development, because you want to have a sense of what's going to happen, mainly because the tax credit is contingent on the design work being compatible with the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. And so you want to know going into the design and as you're doing the design, what historic elements need to be retained, preserved, or alerted to the SHPO so that you're not going to do any design work or construction that would then invalidate the applicability of the historic tax credit. Moving on to a couple different grant sources. Desire is a great website that can provide some different options for what's available in your state, as well as the Foundation Center and also Reconnecting America. I'm going to caveat that all of these grants take time, so knowing the timing process and again talking to your client, which is more often than not a developer, and getting a sense of what their timeline is to see where it makes sense to apply for different grants. And so there are a lot of grants that require a match, and so sometimes that match can be in-kind services or donations of services. Sometimes it is a cash or a investment match, so just understanding which grant sources and how the logistics of the grant work are helpful. And then also there are some grants that can be found through different nonprofits, so like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and other building-specific organizations often have grant options. Moving into utility rebates. So I want to be clear, rebates are not going to finance the project, but they can add up, particularly on multifamily projects where you're already planning on doing sustainability upgrades and you already have these worked into the budget. And so here's a case study in Baltimore where in Baltimore, there are rebates for refrigerators that range from $100 to $150 per refrigerator, smart thermostats as well. So if your project is already planning on doing those types of, or installing these appliances that meet their criteria, then if you have a 49 unit deal, you could easily recoup back over $10,000 in rebates just by paying attention and alerting the developer to the different rebates that are available from the different utility entities. And so I'd recommend for each of your states, double checking your state's energy website to see what they offer, and then also talking directly to different manufacturers of the project. And again, I know this is something that most architects don't get involved in because of the timeline or the fast tracking of a project, but these can be things that you can suggest to the client and to the developer as a way to add value to the project. And then the final funding option that I'm going to mention is CPACE, and this is a relatively new program and it's spreading across the country. So CPACE stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It's an innovative financing program, and it helps multifamily property owners as well as nonprofits, commercial. It can apply to almost any building type. And it's affordable long-term financing for green energy updates to the buildings. And so you're able to, the owners can get the advantages of the energy updates immediately and then pay for them over time through an assessment on their property tax bill. Now, CPACE has to be authorized by the state legislation. And then once it's authorized by the state, then the different localities sign on to it. So you'd want to double check that it is active in your state and in your county where you're working on it. And so far, more than 30 states and the District of Columbia have CPACE enabling legislation, and more than $500 million in projects have been financed through this program. And so this is a program that we're finding is growing, particularly in the state of Maryland. Most of the counties in Maryland have signed on, but not all of them, but just wanted to alert you all to this one. And the way that it works is that it is an assessment, a debt assessment on the property. And so the debt is tied to the property as opposed to the property owners. And so that means that you could do the energy upgrades on your building, and then the repayment of it could also transfer with the property. There are some times when clients just don't want to do energy upgrades to the building, particularly if they're thinking that they're going to be selling their building in the next 5 to 6 years. So oftentimes there's not an incentive for them to do the energy upgrades if they feel like they're not going to see that return on investment. So CPACE is a way for them to see to reap the rewards, but then also be able to transfer it forward with the property. And so it's one of those things that it's interesting how it works with it, and it's 100% financing, and it has typically a 20-year repayment. And you can work with the contractor, and then typically there are individual lending institutions that are authorized to host the CPACE program in the state. One of the other options I wanted to mention, so here's kind of a summary of how, or a case study of how this could work. And so the traditional capital stack typically comes down with a weighted cost of the capital at about 8.63%. And with CPACE, it's able to decrease that by more than a percentage point, and then, decrease the cost of the capital. One of the other nice things about CPACE that we're finding is that it's, particularly in Maryland, where we're based, it's new enough that when clients aren't expecting it, and I don't think that it's something that I could actually do, they get very excited about all of the found money or the savings that we're able to show them because of this program that they were just unaware of. So then some of the quick takeaways from this is that helping with funding should be an additional service, and make sure that your contracts are structured as such. Understanding how much funding is available before you start designing, which I understand is common sense, but as we all know, common sense isn't always common practice. So just making sure that you're scheduling your project in a way that you're not going to over-design for the funding application if needed. And then as much as I love LEED and all the other green rating systems, just a caveat that typically they don't help in financing, or get the different certifications won't help in financing, but it will help in underwriting, and it helps give the project legitimacy. So as you're talking to the clients and trying to help them get a sense of why they should do the certifications or not, or even why they should do green and make it more energy efficient, then that's just something to keep in mind. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation to Mark. Give us 1 second. and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Nikita, and welcome. Can everyone see my screen? Does that look
Yeah, looks good.
Let's see here. All right. Give me just 1 second. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate you all taking time from your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. I'm Mark James, the president and founder of Urban Green LLC. We're based in the District of Columbia, covering the Mid-Atlantic, primarily Maryland, Virginia, and D.C., a little bit in Pennsylvania. But I want to give you today more of a perspective from the developer on how we go about approaching the redevelopment of sites that are purposed to be green or high performance type buildings. And we want to be able to do it so that although some of you may be architects, you want to get a perspective of, from the development side, how we go about making these deals work, how we go about finding financing for those deals. Just a little bit about our company. We are a green, high-performance, affordable housing company. We primarily focus on helping both housing and commercial projects to really expand and to improve their long-term performance. So if we're collaborating with community development organizations, churches, tenant groups, housing authorities, and the like, our real focus is to how do we take that building, make it have the green performance long-term that we want, and then how do we find financing for that project based on those goals. If you're looking right now, a good sense of our services, we do green affordable housing. We do some net zero energy homes and apartment buildings, renewable energy systems, as you see here. And more recently, we've jumped into microgrids and tiny home villages for next year here in Maryland. That'll be exciting to see how that works out. So let's talk a little bit about green money challenges and what are some of the factors that you're going to face as you're thinking about putting together a project that has a selected number of green goals. Well, there are a number of challenges to consider. One of them is that there's a limited pool of investors who actually understand how to underwrite green buildings. What this means is that when you look at the total spectrum of equity or debt investors that are out in the marketplace, it's not like all of them have jumped in and decided that they're going to underwrite green projects. Some may give lip service to it, but there are only a very few select that actually have gotten good at it. So you have a limited pool of investors. Another challenge is that the debt and equity providers, some of them still have some very false perceptions of risk analysis for a green project. So for example, some of them may look at your idea of having or creating savings from the green projects that you've designed, and they may look at that as being a higher risk as to whether or not you actually achieve those savings. They may look at it from a standpoint that what you're proposing to do may seem more pie in the sky to them, but in reality, the risk is not nearly as high as they think it is. Other challenges we've noticed is that there can be a very conservative loan underwriting, which can strip away the financial savings of green projects. I can't tell you how many times we see banks, lenders, and equity investors who, even though you have shown within your projections the types of savings and benefits that will result from the green improvements that you're going to do, it doesn't mean they actually include those in their underwriting calculations. And it's always important to ask them if they are, because that continues to be a challenge today, and people don't realize it's happening to their project. There are some state governments who get it, and there's some that don't. You know, it really depends on which state you're in. We're fortunate in the Mid-Atlantic that the governments here, the state housing agencies and those that do economic development are pushing this, but you might be in a state where they haven't quite fully captured the benefit and the ideals behind green building. So it's important to know what your state's perception of it is and whether or not that's going to be a challenge. Green building funds are often scarce and they're competitive. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is an issue, a challenge that we're trying to deal with now in the marketplace. And most of the programs on the housing side, at least, are for rehab projects. And one of the reasons for that is that most of the programs are trying to get a sense of how you're improving compared to your operational baseline. And of course, for new projects, new construction, there probably is not a baseline and nothing for them to compare to historically. So if you're doing new construction, there may be a little more difficulty in trying to get funding. Less dollars for brick and mortar and more dollars for human services. And all this really means is that while the difference is very minor, when you're looking at some of the green projects now, some of the funding that's coming out, a lot of it's going more towards green education. A lot of it is going more towards how do we teach our tenants, our clients, how to maximize green improvements, or how to do LEED or how to do green communities or whatever green certification they may be doing. And then, if you've been paying attention to the news, there are a lot of states that have been getting cuts from their federal funds. And therefore, you do have to take a closer look at what the state and local level money is doing. So one of the things that if you're wanting to take a look at just how your expectations should be focused, it's important to note that in the total scheme of things, green funding tends to be less than 5% of a deal. Ideally, when you're looking at projects and how those projects are being put together, we find it to be absolutely critical that the team as a whole understands that the deal needs to be able to hold water even without the green improvements. So in other words, if you're going to hit a debt coverage ratio that a funding element is requiring, a funding source, it needs to be able to hit that without the green improvements being there. Now, sometimes that's difficult to do, but ideally, we want to be able to have a project that is able to hit a 1.15 or 1.20 debt coverage without relying on the savings from green building, because it may be that from your underwriter standpoint, that is going to make them feel a little more uneasy about this project's long-term viability. Now, if you're working with someone who gets it, who kind of understands how these things work long-term, that's less of an issue. But again, it depends what you have to work with in your region. In most cases, the green grants and those rebates and credits, because they are only 5% of the project's total development cost, you want to keep in mind that there's this other 95% that you really need to have a good handle on. And I think probably the most important thing here is that 5% or so that's associated with green financing or green rebates, green grants, you want to make sure that you are actually able to clarify and to be very clear about how that is improving tenants' health, green performance, or environmental returns. It's good to have a narrative and a good economic description of how these things are benefiting your project and the stakeholders that are involved in that project. And of course, go to funding sources that acknowledge the benefits of green building. It's just a big help to you, knowing that who you're working with understands this. They have some track record in doing it. It'll save you a lot of unnecessary questions. Now, when you're looking at having a green funding strategy, developers and design teams should have a green priority, sort of a green priority for your project. And what we mean by this is that you may have 20 things that you want to do, but what are the ones that are absolutely critical to the project's success? You want to be able to have a green focus, if you will. Is it carbon footprint? Is it cash savings? Is it an improvement of the tenant's health? What is it? Just energy performance? Whatever the thing is, and I know many people are going to say all the above, but even within your all the above, prioritize those as well. And the reason we state this early is in the project and make this decision early in the project is that it's so easy to chase dollars and to lose sight of what the project really needs long term and what the client has asked for in terms of their goals and objectives. So determine that early, commit to it. You have limited funds that are available, and so being able to target those funds towards those areas that you've prioritized is clearly the best bet. And you want to make this focus clear to your design team. So for those of you that are architects and engineers or other design professionals, you want to make sure you've gotten this information from your developers, from your client. And for those of you that are on the development side, you want to make sure you're communicating this to your design team. Being very clear about those priorities up front is important also, because if you get to a place where you are value engineering your deal, as most of us end up doing, you want to be able to make decisions, and if you need to cut things or modify things, you want to make sure that they are not impacting the most critical aspects of your project. So make these goals and objectives clear to your design team, and also make them clear to the tenants and the stakeholders in your community so that they understand what you're looking to achieve in that project. They may even have ideas, I often find, that will help you. So some of the potential green funding options. You know, as Nikita said, we always start with Desire USA, so I'm not going to focus on that. There is one thing I'm going to bring up about this. The second bullet point there, you see that many of the programs get oversubscribed quickly. So as you've created your green goals, you've got your objectives, you have your green priorities, and you know which ones are absolute musts. As you are going to websites like Desire USA, what you want to be able to do is then look at the programs that fit your targeted goals, contact those program coordinators to determine the status of that program. I can't tell you how many times a program looked great on paper, but as we were ready to go in and get to try to use those dollars or apply for those dollars, of course, the program was oversubscribed. And so it's important to know, when it may be funded again or if it's being discontinued by the time your project goes to construction. One great funding source that we like to work with is Fannie Mae. They have a multifamily green initiative project. Again, this is for those of you that may be involved in the multifamily side of deals. And these finance things like energy improvements, water efficiency improvements. These programs offer higher loan to values on green projects. And what, of course, they want is they realize that your green improvements will create lower operational costs, operating expenses, and as a result, they try to reward you with a higher loan amount. Other organizations that do this, Freddie Mac has a multi-family green assessment program, which basically helps you to get reimbursements for some of the green assessment work that your project may need to do. Freddie also does a Green Up and Up Plus program, and similar to Fannie Mae, they provide higher loan to values and better loan pricing for projects that are doing green improvements. Now, one here that is always a little more iffy at the moment just because of current funding levels. HUD has programs that are great towards energy reduction. Some of them are grants, some of them are low interest loans, some of them are rebate. In the past, they've had programs that were more focused on health, and there is some word that they may be trying to bring more of that back because as of late, there's been much more of a nexus between healthy housing and how we integrate health into the design and construction of our buildings. The U.S. Department of Energy, you should check both at the federal and the city level, your local level. Oftentimes, they may have special funds that have been set aside for green projects. So you want to be able to have your project look up what's happening at DOE. And the same would go for the state and city housing agencies or the city and state Department of Transportation. They oftentimes have programs that could be related to stormwater management, reducing things like your potable water, or even landscaping and street improvements that would give you extra dollars for doing green landscaping. And then Nikita had already mentioned that it's always great to talk to your utility providers to see which incentives they are offering. But at the state and city level, a lot of those utilities, along with the other funding sources that may be available from local government, they're providing these rebates on energy efficient lighting, low flow water fixtures, Energy Star appliances, and insulation thermal envelope improvements. You just want to check to see what is available. And again, you're going to hear me emphasize this probably a few times, mainly because of bad experiences, that we always want to make sure that the program will be continued next year. If you're at the design stage of your project that you're looking at now, you're probably not going to go to construction until next year. You need to make sure that program that you're looking at is still funded for next year, because sometimes they are only continued for 1 or 2 year period. And it's also important to note that if you're thinking about these funds and how they flow into the deal, uh, it's very often that these dollars are actually coming in after they've been installed. So in other words, if you're getting a rebate or if you're getting a grant of some sort, they really want confirmation that you've actually installed this particular energy efficiency improvement or particular material. And so you need to fund these in your budget, even if it's a grant, with the idea that the grant would reimburse the cost or the rebate would come back and reimburse you for those costs. And don't forget to show measurable impact. That's really critical. You know, when you're looking at how funders are bringing green dollars into the deal. It used to be that there was this very select group of green projects. Well, now a number of states have required green performance measures. And so you may also have a lot more competition for green dollars, green rebates, and other incentives. So you don't want to be able to forget that it's so critical that as a design team, as a developer, you can actually show the measurable impact of these things that you're doing in such a way that it makes sense to the layperson who may not be fully vetted on how all the green incentives work. So I thought it'd be great to give everyone a sense of just a quick case study. One project that I managed a long time ago, 7 years ago, has been Wheeler Terrace Apartments in the District of Columbia. This is a green affordable housing project renovated and owned by CPDC, who does some great affordable housing in the Washington, D.C. area. Wheeler Terrace, just to give you a sense of the project vision, on the goals of the project, we knew the project was an acquisition of a very old building. They were looking to preserve the structure of the building, update the systems in the building, HVAC, electric, and plumbing, needed new kitchens, really needed new, for the most part, new interiors. And, you know, this was a high crime neighborhood and there were poor health conditions at the site. And in the midst of all that, how do we go about renewing a new 20-year Section 8 contract with HUD? Well, in looking at those project goals, the green goals that were established very early were that we wanted just to create this new standard for green affordable housing. Back when this was done, the project was the first LEED Gold certified project that was a Section 8 community in the United States. We didn't know that going into it, but we found out that by going through this process and also including green communities along with LEED, that we were setting some standards for how HUD was going to address this going forward. And if you think about those green goals, well, what we did is we then added to that there's been this tenant waste factor. All of you that design buildings and are involved with multifamily or commercial deals, you understand that in many cases when tenants in the building are not paying their own utilities, they tend to have a waste factor for that energy. They leave lights on, they use more water than may be necessary. And in this particular case, with all of those things going on, we wanted to reduce energy consumption by 25%. And so that became a major goal of the project. On financing, I won't go through all of these. I just want you to see the three highlighted areas in green there, sort of emerald green, I guess. Again, HUD had put $450,000 into healthy home housing initiatives, primarily focused on air quality. Enterprise Community Partners, another $50,000 towards green planning, and the Home Depot Foundation, another $50,000. So $550,000 out of a close to $33 million project, but it made one heck of a difference, and I want to show you how. We took the HUD portion of those dollars and very clearly specified what it was that, or how it was that we were using those dollars and what the benefit was going to be for those dollars spent. It's always good, even if it's only $20,000 or $30,000 worth of improvements. It's always good that you can kind of give it its own budget and its own narrative, so that you can explain to a funder exactly why you're doing these energy efficiency improvements or other green improvements for the project, and what the benefit of that was going to be. And as you look at how this deal was done, Another one that was similar to it, as a matter of fact, not even 5 blocks away, Savannah Park, Urban Green did this about 3 years ago. This was another affordable housing deal, 64 units for very low income families, same as the other building, old aged mechanical systems, rising utility costs, and the owner cannot afford to pay for all of the capital improvements. And so with that being in mind, we realized and said to the property owners that if we can focus on increasing energy savings, we can also allow that to translate into increasing the loan amount. And so what was meant by that was that we can take a look at installing solar. We were doing energy efficiency measures, and all of those things combined created an annual savings of about $28,000. Now, anytime you're creating savings and you're able to improve the NOI, the net operating income of that project, it now means that there's actually more money available. That higher NOI does translate into more loan dollars that are available to the deal. So previously, before we got there, the loan probably would have been $3.1 million. But as a result of the green improvements, you're talking about a net loan increase of $374,000, which was a big benefit to the project. And so as you're looking at that project performance from an energy standpoint, what we also did is we ended up dividing the project into two partnerships. There's an energy partnership that just focused on all of the renewable energy improvements on the project, and there's a real estate partnership, which was the traditional one, which focused on the tax credits and doing all of the improvements that are customary to a affordable housing renovation. That energy partnership, I wanted to point out a few things that I think you guys would find interesting. The energy partnership used relevant patient equity sources. So again, when you're talking about funding these things, we created an entity that was just focusing on how we're going to finance green improvements on the deal. And those relevant sources, all that really speaks to is finding those sources, like in this case, we had HUD. In your case, you might have some other source that was relevant to our kind of project. We had a project that wanted to focus on improving health, so we found a source that did that. The energy partnership paid for a number of on-site renewables and energy conservation measures. And again, it saved the $300,000 in construction cost. And we were ended up able to take that $300,000 plus dollars that would have been spent by the project on renovations, and by putting those over to the energy partnership, it freed up $300,000 plus dollars, and as a result, allowed the project owners to use their dollars more effectively. Two things that I would tell you to try to do based on current underwriting. You'll see energy efficiency measures. We try to get them to pay for themselves in a 4 to 5 year period is ideal. There's some very large ones that might be more infrastructure related. We recommend 10 years at the most for a payback period. And in this particular case, try to structure deals in a way that your partnership or your current owners, if they are doing a third party project like a power purchase agreement, that they can assume ownership in due time after that. Now, don't want to spend much more time on this, but you see here that by getting that higher loan amount, we eliminated the gap in the deal, and that meant that the green improvements, one of the ways that your green improvements can help on your project is that if you can help that to translate into a higher loan because of the savings that they create, that is a best thing to remember. So best practices, just a quick summary of those: have a green outcome strategy and design for that strategy. It is very easy to lose sight of what we may have started a project out with. So keep that in mind as you're doing final design and value engineering. Keep all those things in front of you that are high priority green items. Be able to explain how green investments produce the expected outcomes you were looking for. Just being green is not enough anymore. It used to be, but now you need to be able to do a deeper dive and explain why these investments are worth making and how you'll be able to calculate what those outcomes were. Number three, just share your green strategy with your funders and your stakeholders. So important here that that gets done. It's very often that someone further down the road, or even a subcontractor, someone in the local community, the mayor's office, may not be aware that green improvements were a major part of your project's goals. And if you had told them, they may have been able to tell you that there's some special money they could set aside to help your deal. So make sure you share those things with everyone. Use debt and equity sources that understand your goals, sources that are relevant to your project, as I had mentioned previously. And then fifth, just meet with federal, state, and local funders to assess fund availability. So with that, you see our contact information there. I appreciate you guys taking time to listen and hope this was beneficial to you. And I will hand it back over.
All right, thank you very much, Mark and Nikita. That was really great. I think it's really good for architects to have a better understanding and increased awareness of the funding options and what's out there and how it could impact our work. So I have a few questions. One is, do you guys have any thoughts on what items you think are typically can provide the greatest short-term or long-term results in the green priorities and savings for a project?
Yeah.
So, go
ahead, Nikita.
No, I was like, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I'm sure Nikita's probably going to say the same thing. It is always best just to start with the low-hanging fruit. Most of the times you cannot beat the returns that you get from doing thermal envelope improvements, insulation. Lighting is always very helpful, especially in areas that are using a lot of lighting inside your buildings. But we try to get away from going after the quote unquote sexy items because they look great on paper. It's usually the things that you're not always seeing or paying attention to, which are going to give the first bang for your buck, the best bang for your buck, which I'll describe as the lowest amount of money in terms of cost with some of the greatest return. So those things are usually better off before you get to installing these huge renewable energy systems, which I love. But for answering the question, I would start with those basic things.
Yeah, I'd agree with Mark on that. One of the things to make sure you would take a look at to even start is to get an assessment or do an assessment of what your current state of the building is. Because doing a big solar array on a building that doesn't have any attic insulation or roof insulation and has really poor windows, you're not going to need to optimize your systems before you install new renewables. So I'd agree with Mark on that.
And I would think that a lot of times when you're working with an owner, they would be very interested in items that would potentially reduce the operations and the maintenance cost.
Right. And actually, one of the things that we run into sometimes where we have to help the owner change their viewpoint is if an owner has a bunch of fluorescent light fixtures that are all T12 bulbs, sometimes they don't understand, well, why would I replace those with LEDs when I have 20 unused T12 bulbs that I bought 10 years ago that are still good? So helping them understand, there might be a little bit of an upfront cost, but you're going to see so much more savings from actually doing an energy upgrade as opposed to just reusing bulbs that you've already bought.
Right. What kind of projects are eligible for the CPACE funding?
So for that one, it is the majority of projects. So commercial, industrial, nonprofits, multifamily as well. And for the CPACE funding, you just have to prove that your building is going to perform better than a code building. And so the funding is based on how much of an improvement over the code baseline is available.
That's great. Mark, you talked a little bit about health and housing and the connection there. Can you speak to a little bit more about that? Any sources of funding that you know of for that?
Absolutely. The more and more you're starting, there's been a tide coming out from both the health professionals and housing professionals realizing that their destinies are a little bit intertwined. And the result of that has been trying to determine more creative ways that uh, regional hospitals, healthcare providers can take a look at making small investments into projects that might help to reduce the number of people who visit the emergency rooms. Whether that is because of asthma issues, bronchitis, or other bronchial conditions, whether that's from slip and falls that could happen in senior buildings, this idea that health is intertwined with the success of a project, be it residential or commercial, is increasingly having some value and being paid attention to. Now, there's not a lot of funding for it just yet, but groups like HUD, groups like the U.S. Department of Energy, and more recently, even groups like the National Institute of Health, almost forgot that one, might have funding that would be made available probably on a competitive grant basis, as well as local foundations are also considering making these investments. I'll tell you the key thing about it is this. If your project is serving a vulnerable population, children, very low-income families, the homeless, seniors, something like that, whereas there are already pre-existing health conditions from those that are coming into your building, if you're able to say that this funding will somehow help you to improve the health outcomes of those residents, then that tends to grab the attention of those who are coming at it from a health standpoint. And I can absolutely promise you that those that are coming at it from a health or monetary only standpoint won't get it. They won't quite be ready for that conversation. So I would really restrict that conversation to those that are in the health arena to see if they might have some interest in partnering on your deal.
Do you know of any insurance companies that do this? Because I know I get some money or sometimes for a gym membership or something. It seems like they would really benefit from having their members in healthier housing.
We're working on it, and by we I mean folks who've been involved with green building and looking at sustainability and how we're absorbing health. That is an outcome that we're shooting for. It's not there yet, to my knowledge. I've not been able to see a health insurance company fund it, but I think it's close. It's close. And the best way to think about it is that if someone is low income and they are working an hourly job and they or their child gets sick, then we realize that this person is now losing income because they don't have health benefits, perhaps. Now, if that's the case, or if they, through their own illness, it results in them losing income, of course, that's a detriment to their family. And so what we're realizing from a healthcare standpoint is that if we can focus on health, it actually helps to improve the economics of one's household. And of course, that improves the economics of the building. You're not turning over residents. You're not evicting people because they haven't paid rent. Someone has used their money to pay for a very expensive medical procedure that, now, of course, has come out their rent pocketbook, if you will. So these are all things that are being discussed, but not quite there yet. I think in the next year or two, it could happen.
I'm looking forward to that. Can you elaborate on how the second party holding the green improvements and pulling the green costs from the base construction budget was structured and how payback occurred?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it one more time? I think I got it.
So, wanted to elaborate a little on how the second party holding the green improvements and pulling the green costs from the base construction budget was structured and how that payback occurred.
Yeah, so we create sometimes what's called an energy partnership, whereas that energy partnership may be a specific LLC or limited partnership that we set up specifically to purchase, own, and operate renewable energy systems. and sometimes mechanical systems. In that particular case, we sometimes would use that entity, that energy partnership, to take away costs that would have been absorbed by the traditional housing partnership. So, for example, if they were going to try to absorb a new mechanical system for their building, a new solar array for their building, then we're able to take those costs off of the project budget from a housing standpoint and bring it over to the energy partnership, which may have a longer term view of the capital that's going in for energy and when that needs to be paid back. And that's great for us because it means that those who are involved in the energy partnership, they kind of get it. They understand that this is the stuff that may take 10 years for a full payback, but they're not complaining about it because those are waters that they swim in. At the same point in time, by taking those costs away from the housing partnership, those are dollars that the housing was going to have to spend, which have now been freed up and now can be used for other things that may have been value engineered out the deal, or additional green improvements that were going to be cut because of a limited budget, which can now be added back in. So it varies, but solar arrays, renewable energy systems, mechanical systems that are going to produce a cost savings payback within a reasonable time frame, those are all the kind of things that we like to try to absorb in scenarios like that.
You mentioned you had some funding on a project from Home Depot. How do you find out what companies offer this funding?
That is a great question because I've not been able to get a Home Depot grant in 2 years. But one of the things that only reason I found out about that foundation was that one of the nonprofits who educated tenants in the DC area about health issues, they were aware of the Home Depot Foundation's grant. And so and again, that's sharing your green goals with your stakeholders. They sometimes know about opportunities that you aren't aware of. And so by following up on their lead and their recommendation, we were able to find that. And but there are other foundations, you could call Home Depot again, which they do those grants every year. But in that particular year, they really were interested in health. It may be that if you're just focusing on energy performance, then I would contact another foundation and see if they can do something to assist you in your goals. But that's another reason why you want to be very firm and complete about your vision and what are the green priorities for that project.
Do you, this is kind of related, but where do you find partners who are attracted to energy partnerships in specific?
Well, it varies. Again, just starting with the sources that Nikita and I had mentioned. And Nikita, you can add some things to this if you'd like, but I think for the most part is once we've started with all the basics, at that point, it's all about asking around. You just never know where money is hiding. You never know where state government is not funding something now, but they do have it budgeted to start up in the following year. So it's really sharing it over and over and over again with all those stakeholders, so they can try to help you to identify pots of money that may be relevant for your project.
Yeah, and I also add on, there are times when we also talk to local grant writers and people who actually write grants for a living, because they typically are tapped into some other foundations that also have different pots of money. There are a lot of corporations that have a certain amount of money that they're trying to grant away so they can get the tax write-off. So for instance, sometimes Enterprise Rent-A-Car and other large corporations like that, they have just funding that they're trying to give away. And so talking to other grant funders or grant writers can also be a good source of project info.
That's great. That's a good idea. Does Google or Facebook offer any funding? They have a lot of money, don't they?
I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
I'm gonna look into that one. All right, we're running out of time here, but I want to thank you guys again. This was really great. And remind everybody that please check your email for the report for your credits, as well as any other comments or questions you might have, and we will review them. Thanks everybody again for joining.
Great, thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks everyone.
You too.